Hi, I'm Jim Heavey from Wood Magazine, and I've got a slight twist on veneering, and I'd like to show it to you. Now, veneering is technically just taking a very thin piece of wood and applying it to some kind of a substrate, MDF or plywood. And applying a very thin piece of wood to that substrate makes the substrate look as though it were solid wood. Now, this is a burl. Burl would be very expensive if used in solid form, and a lot of times very difficult to work. But in veneer form, it's a lot less expensive, gives you an awful lot more opportunity to use it for an embellishment or some real punch to a project. So on the front of this is our burl, and again, looks really nice. It can be rolled over and put on the face of this, so it actually looks like one board. But then as I turn this, you'll notice on the back side, it's just plywood. And even the end grain shows that it's a multi-ply plywood. So it's actually pretty cool. It's a very unique way of adding interest to a project, very inexpensive, and yet really adds some impact. Now, normally when you get veneer, most of the suppliers will send you a catalog to look at. Some suppliers will actually send out packets like this. This can be ordered. This particular supplier provides a number of different veneers. It was usually used to show salesmen the types of things that they could supply, and a salesman would then bring it into a home to show a homeowner the types of woods that he could do something with. So this is a packet with an awful lot of material in it, and to be honest, a great way to experiment with veneer. And on small little projects, maybe this is plenty. Now, if you do decide that you like a particular veneer, you can order it in what they call a flitch. This is wood as it just comes off the tree. This particular one is a redwood burl. And a flitch, when opened, automatically gives you its mirror image on the next sheet. So you can see on here, the slight whorl pattern is replicated on either side, and the more burled section is in the middle. Now I could put this one next to this one and provide a different look again, or I could fold this one down on itself to do the same thing. So it's called book matching. And what we're going to do is show you a way to join these pieces on ones that we've chosen to provide some nice look. Now, the twist that I was talking about is using a little bit of that burl as an example of something that would normally not have appeared in an older home. And what I'm talking about is a transom. Now, my new shop is just outside the library in our home. And I asked for 10-foot ceilings, which gave me a real good area above the door to put a transom. In days of old, that transom allowed light to come into a room with the door closed without disturbing the privacy of the people who were in there. Pre-air conditioning days, you could open that up a little bit and allow air to circulate, again with the door closed. My idea is a little bit different. I want a piece of veneer on the face of this because it's my shop. And I just feel it's kind of a cool way to show people that behind that door is a woodworking shop. But I've got a little interesting thing to show you, and that's on its face, it looks just like the regular piece of veneer. But when my shop is occupied and it's lit from the back, I think you're going to find some pretty cool lights shining through the back of that and some really nice highlights. So the goal in this is to find a way to attach this veneer to something that will allow that. We're going to use plexiglass. The process for adhering the veneer is about the same as it would be on a regular substrate, but we're going to use epoxy instead. And the substrate, instead of being plywood or MDF, is going to be plexiglass. But it's kind of a cool thought. It's a cool idea. The area is about 16 by 36, so I think it's going to look pretty impressive when I'm done with it. Let me show you how it's done. Now, as always, anything done at home needs a little bit of pre-test and an approval. So what I've done is I've taken a few different veneer samples and I adhered them to a piece of plexiglass. I'm very fortunate to have a lot of veneer samples. I've got all kinds of different things that I've had for years, and I'm kind of hoping to use some of them, and this was the perfect opportunity. So what I did is I experimented with this with 4 different types of veneers. In different ways, they'll all show different lights through them. It depends on how much they're sanded and how relatively translucent they are to begin with. So what I did first is I cut a small piece of 1/4-inch plexiglass. These are attached using 2-part epoxy. Now normally when we do veneering, you can do it using any regular PVA type glue. The yellow glues work really well. There's also a cold press glue, gives you a little bit more time in putting those down, a little bit less bleed through in some of the veneers. There are people that use hide glue on them. On this particular piece though, when it's going on a substrate like plexiglass, none of those glues will adhere well to it. So we're going to use a two-part epoxy. So part of the test to find out which veneer my wife really liked was to go through and test this just to make sure that the process worked really well. So what I did is I took my plexiglass, and we'll do all of this in a second. I just want to kind of highlight it for you. Sanded it to abrade it a little bit to give it some tooth, applied the epoxy to it, and then put the veneer on. And once the veneer had settled in and once the epoxy had cured, I lightly sand off the epoxy that kind of bleeds through the surface a little bit, and this is what we're left with. So to make the choice, it was much easier to put a little bit of mineral spirits on here so she could tell and see what this would really look like once it's got a finish. So let me put just a little bit more on here. I'm planning on applying a little lacquer when I'm done with this, but now you get a pretty good idea of what these samples look like. So each in their own way, they're all very pretty, but each in their own way they have a different type of translucence to them and a different look when we're done. We wound up picking up this one, so this is the one that we're going to put on a big piece of plexiglass and make for a really nice, impressive entrance to my shop. Again, let me gather all the material in here and I'll show you how to start the process. So the first step in prepping your veneer to put on a substrate is to cut that material to size and join it. If you're fortunate enough to have a nice big piece of veneer that covers your entire project in one fell swoop, you're fine. But in most cases, the flitches that you get are relatively small, and they're going to have to be joined up to make the length or the width that it is you're looking for. So if I take this particular flitch, and I'll just take off the first couple of sheets here, and if I put these together, it's a really pretty jointed match across the way here. But at the top, I've got a small break in that veneer. It may also be somewhat irregular running up off this line, and the goal is to put those two pieces together so that the seam itself appears to disappear. So here's the standard procedure used by most people to do this, and it works actually pretty well. If I want these two edges to come together, if I take them and fold them on themselves, like this, and if I cut through both of them at the same time, the resulting cut will give me a very pretty match back and forth between them, and they'll actually lay up against each other. This is a self-healing cutting mat. They're really nice if you get a chance to ever use one of these. Otherwise, you can use a piece of masonite. That works pretty well too. One of the first methods in doing this, or the tools to use in it, is what's called a veneer saw. It's got exceptionally tiny little teeth on here. It does a really nice job of cutting things and leaves a really nice straight edge. The problem I've had with using this saw, especially in some of the more convoluted material, the burl type material, is that I don't know that it always leaves me quite as clean a cut. And little chips out of the edge there really show up. So my personal favorite, and I guess more simplistically, is just to use a razor knife. The key in this is using a fresh blade in your razor knife. It provides a really nice way to cut those two pieces so that they cut cleanly and then join together well. So again, I put a straight edge over the top of these, have a little bit of material underneath both edges, and don't try and cut this on one fell swoop. Don't try and push down really hard and cut them both at the same time. I'm just going to ride the edge of this ruler or this straight edge with my knife and make multiple passes until that piece slips off of there. So if I put pressure on it here, like so, and again, I'm just going to establish the cut line on the first one of these. You can actually hear the blade sometimes cutting through this. Again, we don't want to rush this process. And if you blow it, don't worry about it. You can always overlay it a second time and try and cut it a second time. So let's see, it looks like our edges are cut through. So now if I take these and fold them on each other, I get a really nice clean line. I've got a little divot at the bottom edge here. I can recut this, but you'll kind of get the idea. So this fits together perfectly. There is no light in any of this between the seams. I know it's kind of hard to hold this together with my fingers so that you can see that, but it works really well. And now the issue is keeping it in that position so that when you put it on a piece of substrate, it stays together. I've seen two methods used. I've used this one fairly often. This is using standard painter's tape. By using it across that joint on your first application here, and doing the same down here, you can pull that seam together. This works when I'm doing MDF and plywood type substrates. But we're going to be using plexiglass, and we're going to be using a little epoxy. The veneers in most cases are porous enough. The epoxy has a tendency to seep through the face of this veneer and impact the tape. This tape is much harder to get off, much harder to remove with epoxy on it. So instead of using painter's tape, there's another method, and it's been used forever. Actually, I guess more of a tried and true method. And that is the use of what's called veneer tape. This is it here. For those old enough to remember the postage stamps, they were exceptionally small, very, very thin, and they had an adhesive on the back that you licked on one side and put on. This is the idea here. You may be able to see that this has got a nice little sheen on one side. That's the adhesive. And on the other side, it's dull, which of course is not. So what I'm going to do first is take a little piece of this tape off, and I'm going to use it as a clamp. So I'll wet it, and when I put it on one edge of this veneer, I'll just attach it on one side, and it adheres almost instantly, and I can use that as a clamp to pull. So I've attached this side and then pulled that veneer to match. And if I do the same thing on the bottom edge, I can pull that seam together very nicely. And then to finally hold this piece of veneer straight all the way through, one last piece of tape, in this case would go on from top to bottom. The tape I'm using here too is called a perforated tape. It has small holes in it. There's another way that this tape comes, and that's as a solid piece. But I kind of prefer the perforated tape because when I'm going sideways across the seam, I can see through the perforations and make sure that I'm actually pulling that joint together. Sometimes with the solid tape, it's a little bit tougher to see. So this sets up in just a minute or so. So this is that joint on the opposite side. Now there's no way you're going to make any seam completely disappear, especially when there's an awful lot of figure on it, but look at how pretty that joint is. It's going to look gorgeous underneath that epoxy and the top of that plexiglass. That's the idea behind joining those two pieces. The piece that I've got for our project is much larger. I will have to do quite a few cuts on it, along with some edges on it, and I want to show you a little quick trick on how to do that too. This is the general way to cut, joint, and then finally join these pieces going together. I'm going to do a little bit of the prep work on my larger piece, and I'll come back as soon as I've finished that to show you one or two more tricks. So I'll be back as soon as I'm ready. Well, this is my completed paste up of my veneer. The one that we chose, and you saw that in the earlier part of this video, was this veneer. These are the sizes of that veneer, so like I had showed you earlier, I had to turn these on themselves and cut them and join them. This is kind of an interesting center here. these two little knots that wound up coming nice and close together. They look like a little face, so when I put it up there, it'll remind me that somebody's looking down on me all the time. And what I did to add a little bit of interest was put a mahogany band around the outside of this. We decided that added a little bit of contrast to this and will make a nice looking frame. Now I will show you this one corner, and you'll see how nicely the 45s turned out in here. Really cleanly cut from top to bottom, and they match really well. You would think that it'd be a hard thing because I'd have to cut each one of these pieces of veneer at a 45 and not only join them to the edge here, but abut them here to make sure that they are that perfect 45. I found there's a much easier method. Let me show you how that works. So on this last corner, and I did this on the first three, all I did was take my original mahogany strip and overlay it, the top one to the side. So what I'll do is I'll take a small little angle here, and I want to create that angle by double cutting the veneer. So if I lay this out so it's up against the bottom edge of that veneer and lined up right into the inside edge of that corner, if I now make a razor cut through the top one and the bottom one and remove those two pieces, I get a perfect 45. So again, as we talked about before, nice fresh razor blade. Don't get carried away with your speed. Don't try and cut this all at one time. I am cutting near the edge of this material, so I'm kind of making sure that I don't pull at it. So I pull that corner away. So there goes the top one. The last cut here. And then by pulling away this edge and pulling away this edge, I have a perfect 45. It's actually pretty cool. Now what I'll do is I'll tape the back side much like I taped everything else. We'll make the last long tape there and let this sit for a bit, and then we'll come back and show you how we prep the plexiglass that has to be sanded to provide some kind of a tooth for the epoxy. And we'll mix up the epoxy and apply this. And it goes pretty quickly from there, although there's a pretty good amount of setup time for it. But this is the hardest part. This is the layout part, and to be honest, the more patient you are, the time you take to do this will provide a really nice look. I think that's pretty cool. So we'll be back to show you how to prep that plexiglass. Well, now it's time to prep our substrate. As we were talking about this video all the way through, I talked about the fact that we're doing something with a little bit of a twist. If we were doing regular veneering, we'd be applying that veneer to a substrate like plywood or MDF. And to prep that usually is pretty easy. A real light sanding of the plywood just to make sure that it's nice and flat. Not too much to do with the MDF. Both of those are very absorbent, and they'll make a real easy substrate for applying that glue. And in those cases, we'd use something like the hot press or cold press glue that allows a real good bond of that veneer and not a lot of bleed through. If you don't have that, it's not a real big deal. Regular old PVA glue works just as well. A little bit less setup time, so you have to move along a little bit quicker. But both of those things would be for a regular substrate. We're not going to use that in this case because I want a little bit of translucency in this. So the substrate we're going to use here is plexiglass. Plexiglass is a great material. To put a veneer on it, though, can be a little bit of a problem. And the reason is it's just a bit too dense. It's a little bit too hard and doesn't allow any real penetration of that glue. So what we're going to do with this is we have to abrade the surface some so that the adhesive that I'm going to use on here will have something to stick to. So I'm going to use sandpaper. If it were a small project, I'd just use a pad sander, but this is a relatively large one, so I'll use a random orbit. I'm going to use 120 grit paper. It's going to provide what they call tooth. That's a space, scratch pattern, a space between there that this epoxy can actually bond to. So again, two-part epoxy works really well, but needs something to bite into, and on plexiglass, that will be the scratch pattern. So what I'm going to do is do some sanding. I'll follow it up with a brush like this that usually comes with your vacuum kit to get a lot of the excess dust up. And then lastly, then take a bit of tack rag to it and make sure that it's nice and clean. So here's the idea first. I'm just going to do a small little section so that you get the feeling, and then I'll come back and finish it. When I do the larger work or the additional stuff, I'll use glasses and something to protect my hearing a bit. But let's just do a small little section. So what hopefully you can see here is this has done a pretty nice job of scratching that. Normally you wouldn't. The little protective cover that's on there when you're using it for a window treatment or whatever would protect it against scratches, but these are actually necessary to allow that veneer to sit. So again, what I'm going to do is sand this whole thing smoothly. It doesn't have to be perfect all the way across. Again, all we're doing is kind of abrading it a bit to give some tooth for that two-part epoxy to sit to. I'll follow it up with a good vacuum with a brush, a little bit of tack ragging to it, and once I'm done with that, we'll come back and show you the actual process then of applying the glue and then putting the veneer on it. It's a technique that you'll find is pretty simple. So it'll take me a couple minutes and I'll be right back. Well, I've finished my sanding and now it's time for the glue up. As you can see, I've got this kind of set up here to look like a little bit of a sandwich. I've got a piece of 3/4 inch MDF here, a very dense board at the very bottom. I've got a piece of wax paper on here to keep the glue that's going to squeeze out of this from attaching itself to that piece of MDF. You may notice too, I've got a couple of 4x4s here. They're going to help raise this whole thing so it's easier to get clamps underneath. It works out really well. Almost everybody's got a couple of 4x4s and this is the perfect way to use them up. And then I've got my piece of plexiglass on the top. So there's a couple of ways to clamp that veneer down to the top of this plexiglass. In one instance, you can use what's called a vacuum bag system. And this is what they are. This is a real heavy plastic. You slide your potential glue up in here. You can see it's a little bit small for what I would plan on using today. But you slide it inside and seal this bag. And then draw a vacuum on it. And the vacuum allows the pressure of the air to literally squeeze that veneer down flat to the top. Wine drinkers will understand how this process works. This little pump goes on the top here. A couple of pulls on this pulls out all of the air that's in there and provides a beautiful vacuum. System works just great. And again, they have small ones and big ones, and a lot of people like to use these. But a lot of woodworkers don't have these. So I want to show you a system that utilizes the things that all woodworkers have to do the same process that this does. So again, we're going to start with that sandwich potential. So we've got our MDF and our piece of wax paper in this top. And what I'm going to do is put my veneer on this, put another piece of wax paper on, again to protect the caul I'm going to put on top, and then one last piece of 3/4 inch MDF, and then clamp the whole thing up. So that works like a sandwich. It works really well. The process involves clamping, and I'll show you how that works in a second. But the first part of this involves mixing the adhesive. So what we're going to use in this, instead of regular glue, is a two-part epoxy system. There are a lot of them on the market. This particular one I've used in the past, and I kind of like the way that it works, but they're all fairly similar. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have 2 parts of this resin and 1 part of this hardener, and they'll combine. A chemical reaction starts to happen, and ultimately what it'll do is continue to set until the veneer is hardened onto the top of the surface of this plexiglass. The process actually is pretty easy, and a lot of you have already done this. If you buy the small little 5-minute epoxies that come in that syringe tube, when you press the plunger on there, the resin and hardener have already been proportioned so that what's coming out of there is providing that 2-to-1 mix. That's what it's doing. I'd like to be fairly consistent when I do this as well, because the cure time or set time and the strength of that adhesive is based on how well you do that 2-to-1 mix. Now, if you've got a couple of cups that you're planning on using, as long as they're the same size, they're perfect. So use 2 of one and 1 of the other. This particular one, and I can't remember, to be honest, whether or not I ordered these or whether or not they came with the system to start with, are a couple of, or a series of these wax cups, and they have gradients on them. On one side we have the ounces, and on the other side we have it on cc's. So it allows you to pour in your resin first and kind of to whatever line you want, and then pour the hardener in to follow, and then mix it from there. I've used this in the past. I found that it goes a real long way, but I want to make sure that I make enough so that you kind of get the idea. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use my resin up to about the 100 cc level. So that'll be 2 parts, 150 and another one up to 100. And then I'm going to add 1 part of the hardener up to 150. So that'll give me my 2-to-1 measurement. So anyway, the goal is to do this and make sure that we kind of keep this correct here. It's very hard to take it out if you poured the wrong mixture in or they mount up. So there's our first part at 50, kind of looking through the inside here. And the second part at just about 100. And I think I'm pretty close there. And then finally, hardener that I'm going to put in here till it comes up to the 150 mark. And again, I'm just going to make sure I'll let it come up a little bit short to start with, and then see how much more I have to add. I'd like to be as close to the prescribed 2-to-1 ratio as I can get. So what we'll do now is mix this. There are different viscosities, so you'll find that the more you mix them, the more even that mixture gets, the better off you are. If I were making a very large batch of this, I'd mix for a few minutes first, then pour this into another container and back again, so you're kind of trying to mix up those 2 viscosities. But the point is that as long as I mix this well, I should be fine. Now, a little interesting side note while I'm mixing this, as I spread the adhesive, or the epoxy, it's going to take a while to set up. And I guess if you were to put a thermometer on it, you'd find some heat because of the chemical reaction that's happening there. But because it's so thin, it's not generating really a lot of heat proportionally to the mixture. But the amount that's left in this plastic cup is thicker. It builds on itself a little bit faster. And it's surprising, in probably 20 minutes or so, this will actually be a little bit too hot to even handle. So just an interesting little scientific fact, which I don't understand any of, but the point is that's what actually happens. So I've got this mixed up actually pretty well. Again, the only mistake you can make in using this is not mixing the proportions well to begin with, and then not mixing up this mixture really well to finish. So I think we've done a pretty good job here. And I'm not terribly concerned about bubbles at all. If I were doing this in one of those epoxy resin castings that you see, then the bubbles are more of a concern, but here that's not an issue really at all. So before I spread this on, make one more little wipe down with my tack rag. Again, this is no different than prepping something for regular glue. You just want to make sure that your surfaces are clean and dry, and epoxy is really no different. If this were regular PVA woodworkers type glue, the clock on it would start the second that you put it down there, and if you're not down with all of your stuff done in 5 minutes or so, it's a little bit too late. This I have plenty of time. I'm going to spread this on a lot of different systems for doing that too, or a lot of different ways to do it. I'm going to use a little, this is a rubberized applicator, and it's made with a lot of different edges to it. I'm going to use the smallest one. This guy's got just really tiny little teeth on it, and will allow a really nice even mixture. I'd like to find something even with less space on them, but this is it. Something like this would provide way too much glue, and of course this you'd have it coming out of everywhere. So I'm going to use this small one to apply it, and I'm just going to do it evenly, and I'm going to allow that glue to just slop over the side. It's just fine. Again, I'm protecting everything with a piece of wax paper. So you'll see as we put this on, And now I've noticed a little bit of warmth even in this cup now, and we've just done this for the last couple of minutes or so. So anyway, this is the idea. And again, with epoxy, you have plenty of time. So it's not like you have to rush like crazy to get this done. So what we're going to do is spread this evenly on the whole surface. All right, so I think we've got a pretty good application. Looks pretty good all the way around. And now what I'm going to do is lay my veneer on. And the interesting part, I guess, for those that haven't done this, is that when you lay the veneer on, you're always doing this with the tape side up. Seems kind of strange. But every place that I use painter's tape, or the veneer tape, there's an actual thickness. So if this were reversed and put on the veneer, on the substrate the other way, any of these little thicknesses will definitely telegraph through to the top side. So you'll literally see little marks, these little tiny holes and everything. By putting them on the tape side up and gluing them down that way, when I come back to sand this, all I need to do is sand off the tape, and I know I've sanded down far enough to have removed everything right down to the veneer, because I don't want to sand too much to remove veneer too. So it's always tape side up when you're doing this. And now that I'm pretty comfortable that it's here, we'll put another layer of wax paper on here. Again, because I want to protect the caul that I'm putting on here. And my last caul, like so. And we're ready to start clamping. Now the goal in clamping is to keep all of your pressure even across. If I just put regular clamps, which most of you have, like these, they don't have quite the depth, quite the throat to be able to clamp all the way across this and provide even pressure. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have monster clamps like these can go all the way across to the center and provide an even pressure in the middle, and the smaller clamps used around the outside edge. But a lot of you don't have these. So here's the system I'm going to suggest you use, and I use it fairly often. This is called a caul. And all it is a couple of pieces of 1/2-inch plywood, just scrap plywood glued together. The net result is it makes it exceptionally thick and exceptionally dense and extremely strong. So it's really not going to flex much at all. In a perfect world, I would have sanded away the black areas that you see on the front here so that the middle of this is thicker than are the ends, so that when I clamp this on both sides, it puts more pressure in the middle than it does on the outside edges. That helps transfer your clamp weight or your clamp pressure from the outside edges to the middle. And I've done that. But here I've made something I think will be a little bit easier. These are those same pieces, but to provide a little extra clamping pressure, I just took some of my excess veneer and put that down underneath it, in about the middle someplace. And I'm hoping you can see this, but by doing that, if I press on either end, this rocks. Okay? Which means that if I press on the ends of this, I put more pressure in the middle than I do at the ends, and that'll provide a more even clamping pressure across the center. The ones that I've done here, I don't have to worry about gravity knocking them off. So I've got a couple of these set up this way. And a couple set up here. and I've got corresponding pieces below. And I'm going to try and set these up about as evenly spaced as I can. I know there's probably a math formula for how much pressure is provided across an even span, but I was never good at math, and I'm going to guess that I've got it correct here. I've done this often enough with other things that I think will be pretty close. And then to balance these, I have the same thing underneath, but because these most likely will fall off while I'm trying to do it, I just put a little piece of masking tape on. So what I'm going to do is put those opposite each other. What I'd like to do is do my clamping in the middle first, so that what it's doing is it's starting to force glue this way and this way towards the perimeter, as opposed to clamping all the way around the outside, which technically could trap glue in the center of this. So we'll do the center of this first. This is sometimes a little bit of a challenge to get these first ones going, but once you do, the process goes pretty quickly. So again, this is just going to hold this down on one side. I'll just kind of set it for a minute. Let me move it towards the end here a little bit more. Okay. And once I get these on both sides, then I can start to tighten them. Like so. Okay, so now I can put a little bit of pressure on them. And as soon as these touch on either end, I know that they've put plenty of pressure on the center. So that's my first set. And I'll work my way down through all of these. The goal in this, again, is to clamp these evenly all the way through. I'll finish with these on the outside edges, and then I'll add more clamps to the middle part of these to give me a little bit more even pressure. And since I've got these big things, I'll probably use these as well to come up through the center. The idea here is you have to use what material you have. This will extend the normal short-throated clamps to make them actually do a better job across the center, but the goal is to provide a much more even clamping pressure. And again, I want to start from the middle. I'll move this one down just a bit. We'll clamp this one up second, then we'll go to the next one, the next one, the next one. So while I'm doing this, we'll just kind of let you see what I'm doing, and when I'm all done, this is going to have to sit for about 24 hours. So tomorrow we'll come back. I'll take these off and you'll get a chance to see how well this did sit. And then the final part of those is actually sanding off the amount of epoxy that would have gotten through some of that material. And you see that in the morning until I've just removed the veneer tape. Provides a beautiful look, and I expect that we'll have a nice glue up. So anyway, I'm going to do this next time I see you. It'll be 24 hours since this has been sitting around, and I think you'll find it works pretty well. Well, it's been about 24 hours since we put the clamps on, and I've taken off most of the clamps. I've saved the last one so that this reveal can be fresh for us both. Never too sure exactly how these are going to turn out because you can't see anything underneath, but the hope is that we should be in pretty good shape. So again, this is that top caul. And then here is our wax paper covering. Looks like it's a little bit stuck at this end. That's why this was so important. The glue is definitely going to squeeze out, the epoxy is, and I'd rather see it attach itself to this than the cauls that we put underneath it. So I'll tell you what, I couldn't be happier with this. Let's try and pick this up here a bit. So the epoxy has blended this veneer into the plexiglass beautifully. It's pretty much about the flattest that I can imagine it would be. I'm very happy with the fact that it seems as though the pressure was even across the face. And again, you saw how we did that using those cauls. The idea now is that we have all of this tape, and if you remember, that's kind of how we held this piece together originally. What I'm going to do then is I'll probably just do a little bit of it for you, and I'll finish it up off camera. But I'm going to sand a little bit of this area away and show you once I have removed the tape itself, it means that I've gotten down to the level of the veneer. And once I'll do that overall, I'll probably use a much finer grit of sandpaper to kind of clean up and even this off. It's a very slow process. I don't want to get carried away in any spot here, because if I sand too much, I'm going to actually sand through the veneer to the plexiglass, which would be a bad thing. So I'm going to work on this corner. Again, this is the tape area here. And I'll use 220 grit sandpaper. We could probably use something even finer, a 320 or a 400, but I think for a minute this will work pretty well by taking this off. And again, it's a very gentle, kind of a light touch to do that. And let me start this, let me show you what it takes to get this off, and then we'll talk after that. Okay, so here's the idea. So you can see it didn't take much to get that tape off of there. So now what I've got is that really pretty 45-degree corner, which we showed you how to do. The blend between the veneer and the outside banding looks really good. And the goal now will be to complete that sanding throughout this whole thing. Once I'm done with that, I'll real lightly sand, maybe with 320 paper or 400, just to make sure that it's all nice and flat. And then take a couple of looks through this to make sure that I've got the amount of veneer removed that will still provide some translucency, and yet at the same time be able to show a real pretty light on it when there's no direct or backlit light from it. So the process actually works pretty well. This would be the same type of thing if I were doing it on plywood or MDF, except that I would be doing that same kind of sanding. There most likely wouldn't be as much glue on the surface, but it would go pretty quickly taking that the tape off the front. This is also why we left the tape up when we did that glue up. So that's what it'll take. It's going to take a little time to finish this up. Once I'm done with this, I'll sand it nicely, and I'll probably shoot a couple of coats of lacquer on it. That'll preserve the look. It'll bring back a lot of the real nice highlights back in this. The next time we come back, we'll have the frame made and installed so you can see how well this transom idea works. So this is our completed project. During the daytime and even with the lights on, the panel in back, the transom, looks like a solid piece of wood. It has a nice little border around the outside of it, and I think the view in general is pretty nice. But when I work in my shop, when the lights are on the back side, you'll see that the panel itself has a really pretty glow to it. And I think that pretty glow shows all of the beautiful veneer through that. In fact, the two little eyeballs on there that were placed in the center makes it almost look like you're looking down on my work. So during the time when I'm in the shop, I think that looks pretty cool. And even later, when the day is done and I close back up, I think what's interesting is that light can wind up being a very pretty night light. So all in all, we're pretty happy with the project. Again, it shows how to use a piece of veneer in a slightly more creative way on plexiglass this time instead of solid wood. And I think you'll agree that the effect is pretty good.